Fidelity High, the people you dig, the records they love.
Keith Morris is a punk rock icon. He was a co-founder and original singer of the pioneering punk band Black Flag and appears on their groundbreaking 1979 debut, the Nervous Breakdown EP. He was also the co-founder and frontman of the Circle Jerks, and is the frontman of the punk rock supergroup Off, with members of Red Cross, Rocket from the Crypt, and Burning Brides. Additionally, he is a member of the band Flag, along with former Black Flag members Chuck Dukowski, Des Cadena, and Bill Stevenson, as well as Stephen Egerton of The Descendants. He has also appeared in the major motion pictures Repo Man and Sid and Nancy. Last year, DeCapo Press published his anticipated memoir, My Damage, the story of a punk rock survivor. It received critical acclaim, with the LA Weekly calling it an illuminating read, while Men's Journal called it an insightful and expansive look at an unconventional life.
This is Keith Morris, and my Fidelity High is Love It to Death by Alice Cooper. Let's party. I bought this record because I loved the cover. I was going through a period of time, we purchase records sometimes just based on what's on the jacket. I'm going to hold this in my hands, I'm going to be looking at it, and I'm looking at these five freaks. Like, these guys look like something out of a circus. I've never seen anything like these guys. Here's this guy in the middle, surrounded by these guys that look like dwarves and giants and midgets and drug addicts, and they've dropped acid, and he's wrapped in a cloak, and he's wearing a woman's blouse, and he's sticking his thumb out from underneath this long, lengthy piece of fabric he's wearing. He's sticking his thumb out like it's his penis. I'd never seen anything like it. There's a single light shining down on them, like a stage light. Or if you actually went to the circus and you were watching the three rings, there would be a light shining down on the guy he's the head guy who says, "Ladies and gentlemen, over here we've got the elephant that breathes fire and is going to go on a rampage and stomp on the woman that swings on the trapeze," and all sorts of fun stuff like that. The album that I'm talking about is Love It to Death by Alice Cooper. And Alice Cooper, they're all guys from Arizona. So they are a bit sun-baked and a bit sunburnt, deep fried. Then they'd moved to Detroit, and I guess in that move to Detroit, they probably picked up some stuff from bands like the Stooges and the MC5 and the Amboy Dukes, even Bob Seger, early Bob Seger. And these guys, I'd actually read somewhere that they swipe stuff from some of these guys, and it's like, you know what? Even if they did an amazing job. This record rocks from start to finish. It gets ugly. It gets dark. There's some really twisted, like, insane scenarios on this. And it ends with a track that was written by a guy named Rolf Harris, an Australian matey, who was famous. Actually, it was a little bit of a hit here in the United States. Tie Me Kangaroo Down Sport. Tie Me Kangaroo Down. Take Me Quality Back, Jack. Take Me Quality Back, yeah. But anyways, I'm a huge fan of Alice Cooper and the guys that he plays with. When at this time you say Alice Cooper, you mean the Alice Cooper Band. Alice Cooper Vincent Fournier would not be who he was if he did not surround himself with the guys that he surrounded himself with. His band, these guys, for about 4 or 5 albums, right up there with Creedence Clearwater, right up there with Steppenwolf, as some of the greatest rock bands, loud music rock bands, party bands in the United States. When I bought it, it was a brand new record. I was 16 years old, and I was up for the party factor. I was up for the freak out. Right around this time, I would also be grooving on some Deep Purple and all sorts of other fun stuff. I grew up with the Beatles and the Who and the Kinks and the Hollies and AM radio and the British Invasion, and moved into Steppenwolf and Grand Funk and all sorts of fun stuff like that. A lot of when I started my drug experimentation, when I started smoking pot, when I started dropping speed, I moved away from a lot of the music that I'd been listening to, and I wanted something more aggressive, something more biting, just something that was certainly going to irritate my parents. And this Alice Cooper album certainly fit that bill. When it comes to the punk rock movement, we were always wanting to hear more aggro, in-your-face, louder music. We lived here in Southern California, and we were getting buried with the Laurel Canyon sound. And I don't mean the early Laurel Canyon sound, which was, produced some of the greatest albums ever recorded. We can talk about the Byrds, we can talk about Buffalo Springfield, we could talk about Arthur Lee and Love, we could talk about the Doors. Those are all amazing bands. They all made amazing records. But Laurel Canyon started to get watered down, and it all of a sudden became, rather than who's got the acid, it turned into who's got the wine coolers and who's got the cocaine, and, let's go get our hair styled and let's get our cars polished and buffed and shined and detailed, and we're going to drive up and down Sunset Boulevard, and we're going to be driving in our convertible so we can wave to all of our friends and oh hey, look at us. We needed an alternative. We needed an alternative to all of that crap. Now, when I say crap, I'm not like dissing what happened, because some of it's actually pretty good, but who needs to own the Eagles' greatest hits? That's retirement home music. That's rock music critic music. We wanted to just rock. We wanted stuff to be on fire. We wanted smoke bombs and Riot on Sunset Strip. We wanted loud, in-your-face music. I believe that would be one of the reasons why I'm sure Pat Smear would head to a record, love it to death. I'm sure Don Bowles, who played drums in the Germs, I know he was there because he was over there in Arizona. Yeah, there was just too much Fleetwood Mac Eagles stuff going on. And all that stuff has its place, but not anywhere near what we were doing. The thing that we have happening with the Alice Cooper band, they're a bunch of freaks. They obviously look like their girlfriends are the ones that either design their clothes or purchase their clothes for them. And over the course of their first two albums, Easy Action and Love It, not Love It to Death, but Pretty's for You, they're kind of struggling with song structure. Maybe not struggling. Maybe that's just what they wanted to do. That's what they were creating at the time, this mixture of acid and psychedelia. And there are little bits and flourishes of the psychedelia on Love It to Death. Not like the first two albums. When they, I guess when they started creating Love It to Death, they had started working with Bob Ezrin. And Bob Ezrin was going to play a big role in what they were going to do for the next, I believe, 4 albums, because they became one of the biggest bands in the world. They were certainly one of the biggest bands in America. And part of this was due to the fact that Bob Ezrin came into the fold, and he was the guy that said, why don't you try this rather than doing that? Let's add some horns, or let's add a string section and see how it works out. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. We'll scrap it. But they were in the presence of a guy who probably really cared and probably saw the abilities of these guys, because they are really, truly a great band. And maybe they were just tapping into little bits and pieces over the course of the first 2 records. Maybe they were starting to show signs of like really developing into like a really structured band. And that's what happened on Love It to Death. With Black Flag, we certainly referenced the Alice Cooper Band. I'm 18, Caught in a Dream, Long Way to Go, stuff off of Killer, You Drive Me Nervous. I mean, obviously, You Drive Me Nervous. I'm about to have a nervous breakdown. We had a lot of different things that we were tapping into, a lot of different bands, a lot of different music. You have to understand, our guitar player was a deadhead. And maybe part of our situation in Black Flag was, we don't want to do that. You can listen to that as much as you want, but we don't want to do that. We're not going there. So we, rather than referenced it as something that we wanted to take from, we referenced it in a way that we would use it as an example of what not to take from. As for the Alice Cooper Band, when Chuck Dukowski joined the band, he certainly was a big fan of Alice Cooper. I know I was. I know Robo was. I know that Brian Migdal, our original drummer, was a fan of Alice Cooper. So he could have, it's possible. I mean, I think it could be correct to say that, yes, Alice Cooper, for about 3 or 4 albums, certainly played a role in what we were doing. It's been mentioned that Johnny Rotten in the Sex Pistols mimed I'm 18, and that's Alice Cooper's first hit. That was actually a pretty big hit for them. You know, and the great thing, one of the great things that happens for a band, if they have a hit and they're getting played on the radio, it just opens more doors for them. You know, these guys could have been a club band for the rest of their lives if they'd not written a hit. So getting back to Bob Ezrin and his work with the band, he played a pretty big role in what happened with these guys. What was brilliant about the Alice Cooper Band and their stage presentation was all of the stuff that they did while they were on stage. Not only including the musicmanship of the guys that are playing in the band that are playing the music, this totally brilliant band, but some of the goofy stuff that Alice Cooper was doing. You know, he popularized the straight jacket. Who else have I seen show up with a straight jacket? Jack from TSOL. Okay. Then there was the electric chair. I was a junior in high school, and one of the girls in one of my art classes, the Monday morning after the Alice Cooper Band played at the Long Beach Auditorium, she was just beaming. She said, "Keith, I went on a date, and my date took me to see Alice Cooper, and I knew nothing about the music, but the show was so great, all of the flashing lights and the smoke, and they electrocuted him in an electric chair on stage." I didn't get to see the Alice Cooper Band until the Killer tour, where they performed at the Hollywood Palladium. And of course he did all of that stuff. But of course the band were further in their career. They'd gotten tighter with the music. They'd become better songwriters. It was incredible. I mean, I would go on to see Schools Out at the Hollywood Bowl. The guy that flew in over the Hollywood Bowl actually was arrested and fined. It was some big fine because he flew in over the Hollywood Bowl to drop women's underwear. You know, when you bought that album, it folded open like the top of a desk, and you had a record that was wrapped in a pair of women's underwear. That was pretty exciting. And that show was incredible. But getting back to Love It to Death. Love It to Death is their, I guess, would be their springboard. This was going to change their worlds. It certainly changed a lot of people that listened to music. It certainly changed some of their worlds. It's just a great party record. I'm kind of speechless right now because I'm holding it in my hand, and I'm looking at Neil Smith. He's sitting on a block, but it looks like he wants to be riding a motorcycle. And you have when we talk about bass players, you know, some of the first names that come up would be, say, Jack Bruce, who played in Cream, and Paul McCartney from the Beatles. I certainly would cite Dennis Dunaway as one of the great bass players, just an incredible bass player. You know, we would go on to see like a guy like Trevor Bolder, who played in the Spiders from Mars. He's also an amazing bass player. But Dennis Dunaway is just his kicks on stage and his Gibson bass, incredible. When looking at Alice Cooper and all of the things that he did on stage, all of the theatrics and all of the special lighting and all of the crazy clothes and all of that stuff. I wholeheartedly loved that and appreciated that, but I'm not the guy to go there. I'm just a regular, everyday guy. I align myself more along the lines of, say, Ray Davies. He's one of my heroes. Alice Cooper is certainly one of my heroes. I mean, I wouldn't be talking about this record if he wasn't. All of these guys are. Michael Bruce, Neil Smith, Dennis Dunway, Glenn Buxton. You know, these guitar players, they're certainly underrated. You know, whenever we talk about great bass players or great guitar players, these guys, they're never in the mix. You know, when we talk about great guitar players, you know, everybody wants to say Eric Clapton and Jimmy Page and Jeff Beck and John McLaughlin and, you know, all sorts of characters. But these guys they're Glenn Buxton's never in the mix, and he's an amazing guitar player. The same with Dennis Dunway. When we talk about great bass players, it's always people like Jack Bruce and Paul McCartney, you know, Jaco Pastorius. Oh, boy, you know. And Dennis Dunway never gets the props that he deserves. He's never in the conversation, and he's an amazing bass player. I'm floored by some of the characters in my band off, and some of the people that they cite as influences. I know that Stephen McDonald loves Dennis Dunway, but at the same time, the guys in my band also like Rush and Kiss. And whenever we have the opportunity to talk about the music that we like, Alice Cooper for me is always Alice Cooper and the Spiders from Mars, David Bowie and the Spiders from Mars, Mott the Hoople, and Deep Purple Mach 2. But these guys, the guys in the Alice Cooper band, they're up there with all of these other players, as good if not better. I'm just kind of wondering why they all went their separate ways. Like, why did the Alice Cooper band just decide to no longer be the Alice Cooper band? I know that at one point there was the Billion Dollar Babies, which was a couple of the guys in the band. But after this band just kind of disintegrated, everybody just, I guess, ran off and started to do other things. I know that Neil Smith became a real estate agent. That's kind of interesting. That's certainly kind of interesting. I know that Glenn Buxton had become such an alcoholic that he eventually, I believe, drank himself to death. Now, I know recently the remaining members got back together, Dennis Dunway, Neil Smith, and Michael Bruce. And I heard the recording. They played in some little record store somewhere, and I heard the recording of a couple of their songs, and it was as good, if not better, than it ever was. Like something, if you're an Alice Cooper fan, certainly something to look forward to. Now, I also played a festival up in outside of Montreal, the Amnesia Fest, and Alice Cooper was playing. And he was playing with all of these new people. I think there was some female guitar player and a bunch of guys that looked like they just auditioned from their other bands on Sunset Boulevard over at SIR. And I was very leery, like I don't know what to expect. I'm not going to have high expectations. I'm gonna set the bar extremely low. And when they played the Ballad of Dwight Fry, it was mind-bogglingly good. Yes. But I want to see the last remaining members. I want to see that band. Those are the guys that I want to see because those were the guys that I grew up with. I found myself in a situation where I'm sitting with a younger producer, a guy who has played in No Age. He's played with the Wrangler Brutes. He's played in a couple of bands on the East Coast. His name's Kundo, one of my favorite characters. I, in fact, just saw him perform with Ty Segall, Ty Segall's one of my heroes, one of my modern, young heroes. And we're sitting, we were going to watch a football game, but my television wasn't working. So I said, hey, let's listen to some music. Let me play you some music that I listened to when I was younger, and these are some of the records that I think are some of the greatest records ever recorded. Now, this isn't rock critic guy, Exile on Main Street, Keith Richards singing Happy or what have you. This isn't Bob Dylan's the greatest poet of our time and his records are untouchable and it has nothing to do with any of that stuff. No band, no Van Morrison, none of that stuff. None of that senior citizen rock stuff. None of that retirement home rock or whatever. I busted out Humble Pie, Rock On. I busted out Captain Beyond's first album. And I certainly played him Love It to Death and Killer. And he was in awe. He was like, this music has a vibe. This music has a breath. This music has a soul. This music, you can almost, in some instances, hear the guys, or actually maybe picture the guys looking at each other while they're recording live in the studio, and it's the first take or the second take. It's not like some layered thing where, well, I'll send this to you and you can add what you're going to add, and then you can send it to Frank over. He's living in London right now, and then Frank can send it to Jaime, who's living in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. And we'll be a band. I played him the Who's Next album. And I played him Deep Purple Fireball. Some of these bands he'd probably heard of somewhere down the road, but had never listened to them. And I played him Smash Your Head Against the Wall by the Ox from The Who, John Entwistle's first solo album, which was also the first solo album by any of the guys in The Who, and it's certainly the best album any of those guys put out on their own. And Kundo was he was taken aback. It was like, Keith, this this is amazing. I need to come over. We need to start doing this on a regular basis. And Love It to Death was one of the albums that I played him. And he was in awe. It was like, you listen to the clarity and listen to the vibe. It's like these guys, they're playing together, and there's something about it where it's not overproduced. It's not like this needs to be placed here and this needs to be placed over there. And, the radio station's not going to play it unless the vocal is buffed a little bit. And, it was just none of that kind of thing. None of this modern tune-up, tone-deaf, whatever, auto-tune. Nothing like that, We got into this thing where we went through a certain period of time where the drums were the loudest thing because everybody needed this sex beat. Everybody needed this bump and grind. Everybody needed to pump their fist. It's like everybody's in a stadium and it's got to be stadium big and large and we will rock you and all of that kind of stuff. All of this stuff had a very it has an earthy quality, a very economical. Everybody plays what they need to play. Nobody's stepping all over each other's parts. Nobody's playing all over each other's parts. And the Love It to Death is a perfect example of like just a great rock record, a great party record. And the starting point, if I was going to take this album and play it for a friend or somebody that I know that's never heard it, I'm going to start with track 1 and play the entire album from start to finish. This isn't some marathon. There are a couple of lengthy songs. One song's maybe 9 minutes long, but it's also one of the greatest songs on the record. The Ballad of Dwight Fry, with the guy getting out of the mental hospital and freaking out, standing on a street corner, and then trying to go and talk to his daughter and trying to explain what happened to me. And, it's just, maybe you don't know. Maybe you've never heard the album, but I start at the very beginning.
Thanks for listening to Fidelity High. For an extended version of this episode, including songs from the featured artists, please visit fidelityhigh.com.